Imagine, if you will, a 10 mana sorcery that says you win the game. It can be whatever color you want it to be. Part of the point of the exercise here is that it doesn't matter. In fact, it can be double Wooburg, because we can power creep to nothingness. It's been 2 decades at this point. Now, an important thing to note about this card is that both of these versions are, strictly speaking, cards that Wizards could just print. These are cards that work within the rules of Magic the Gathering. They just don't work within the philosophy of Magic the Gathering, because Magic is meant to be an interactive game with a sense of back and forth, and also deck building is an important part of the game. And if this card existed, well then, you would just have decks that were based entirely around turboing it out in every possible format where it existed. Now, you might say that it costing 10 mana, colored or otherwise, is in some way a restriction upon the card. And let me say that this card, much like Omniscience, does not in fact cost 10 mana. What it costs is 1 cheat. A cheat is some way of getting the card onto the board, onto the stack, basically getting it to do its thing without going through the regular channels. Some part of the power budget of many of Magic's best cards throughout history is the fact that they have an inbuilt cheat system, or that they enable cheating cards in some way. The Urzatron lands are a classic example of they allow you to cheat this category of cards, which is to say 7 mana colorless spells. Once you understand that this is how many cards actually interact with the game of Magic the Gathering, you will start to see cards existing really in all this sort of space. They cost 1 cheat, but it's this kind of cheat, or it's that kind of cheat. Living End is a perfect example of a card that requires a really specific kind of cheat to be played effectively at all. The Eldrazi Titans of any particular kind require cheating in the form of either accelerating a bunch of colorless mana or just playing a creature out for free in some way. But importantly, they only get their best effects if you cast them, as opposed to, say, sneak attacking them from the graveyard. In this way, we see that mana value past a certain point does not matter. Omniscience is not a card that costs 7 and 3 blue. It is a card that costs 1 cheat. And when you understand 1 cheat as a cost to be played to get an effect or some sort of ongoing board state into play, you start to understand that there is a level of balance here beyond just mana value. A perfect example that exists in-game, printed by Wizards just for me, I like to think, is Jin Kataxius, because it has 2 cards that are both in Phyrexian. One of these cards costs 7 mana and the other costs 10. One of these cards reduces your opponent's hand size functionally to 0, and the other one counters the first spell your opponents cast each turn. Now, anyone who does not own these cards, saying that they could correctly identify which is which of the Phyrexian languaged cards, is lying. Because, let's be clear, one of these costing 7 mana and one of these costing 10 mana doesn't matter, because they're both, more than 6. The reality of these cards is that the mana cost is just flavor at that point, and the real differences exist in how resilient they are to removal. One of these is a 5/4 as opposed to a 5/5, which is more meaningful than the difference between 7 and 10 mana, and the difference in what kind of cheats you can use to put them onto the board and what they provide immediately after their cheats. Circling back around to Living End, it's possibly my favorite example of just an absolutely fantastic combo card, because it both requires a specific kind of deck building and a specific board state for the card to be as fantastic as we all know it can be. You need to have a bunch of stuff in the graveyard. You need to not have stuff on the board and have your opponent have stuff on the board so that the graveyard swap situation is inevitably in your favor. And the reality of balancing a card like that has nothing to do with the fact that it has no mana cost, or because, let's be clear here, the suspend 3/4 mana is not a mana cost. It is an excuse, a pretense. The thing that makes Living End healthy or unhealthy is the fuel and the payoff that we are putting into it. If you are cycling creatures for 1 mana to fix up your mana base or draw cards and then playing a bunch of them and maybe potentially having a creature in your graveyard that enters to give everything haste and alpha striking your opponent to death, that's okay. If you're evoking Grief to repeatedly thought seize your opponent and then Living End is griefing your opponent repeatedly, that's much closer to the borderline of that's really not very fun play and is largely just preventing your opponent from playing the game. If you are cascading at instant speed, which means that you can grief your opponent during their draw step after they've drawn for the turn, but before they've had a chance to sorcery speed play the card that they've potentially drawn, that's ban worthy. There is no situation where Living End cascading at instant speed to grief your opponent in your draw step is a game plan that is gated in any way by mana cost. The problem there is simply the fact that it is happening. Omniscience is a perfect example of a card that, once it is in play, simply allows things to happen that should not be happening in a Magic the Gathering game. Its power exists in a lack of restrictions. There is no restriction on, say, card types that Omniscience allows you to cast for free. I mean, Omniscience, if it let you cast instants and sorceries for free, that would still be pretty dang amazing. And in fact, the standard Omniscience deck that currently exists would be largely the same. It lets you cast any number of spells per turn for no mana, which means that if you do not have a win condition in your hand, your deck can simply be full of card draw and card selection, and you may cast all of it until you get to the cards that actually win you the game, or alternatively, the cards that put you in such a advantageous board state, despite not actually being win conditions, that you have functionally won in all but name. Omniscience even works on your opponent's turn, allowing you to hold up counter magic, the most absolute and uninteractable form of protection for your control deck. I have 2 more comparisons here that I want to make. One is the absolute direct comparison of Omniscience to One with the Multiverse, a card in Standard, admittedly soon to rotate, which, for the simple cost of 1 cheat, provides you with free spells. Card advantage because you can cast things from the top of your library. And indeed, this is so much worse than Omniscience, simply because you can only cast 1 spell per turn. If I spend my free spell for the turn on card draw, then I have to spend mana like a simple plebeian for the rest of time. One with the Multiverse doesn't discount my spells on my opponent's turn, so I have to pay mana for my counter spells and can be taken advantage of like some regular control player. Indeed, One with the Multiverse is the card that Abuelo's Awakening should have been targeting this entire time, and could have been targeting this entire time until Foundations added Omniscience back into the card pool. And it wasn't, because frankly, One with the Multiverse is not good enough as a card for 1 cheat. The tension that exists between playing a deck that accelerates out One with the Multiverse and then being able to win the game with One with the Multiverse in play is just too much when compared to, say, mono-red aggro decks. But the real comparison that I want to make here is possibly my favorite card ever designed, Arcane Bombardment. Because Arcane Bombardment is a card that costs 6 mana, just low enough that you might sometimes actually play it. But realistically, Arcane Bombardment costs 1 cheat, because if you do not cheat out the card, it doesn't do anything. On the turn that you play Arcane Bombardment, it is a blank piece of cardboard if you have cast, say, any instant or sorcery for the turn, because it checks for your first instant or sorcery spell cast for the turn, not the first card that it sees. And let's be clear, it works on every turn. So you can trigger it on my turn and then your turn and then my turn and then your turn. And in fact, one of the only ways to make Arcane Bombardment work is to find a way to be reliably refilling your hand and casting spells on each player's turn, because it's also random. Like, it's randomly exiling cards from your graveyard. And so In addition to the challenge of cheating out the card in the first place, you then need to have a graveyard of cards that is not so muddied that Arcane Bombardment is not just picking bricks from your graveyard to give you nothing. I miss Arcane Bombardment. Playing it was really, really fun. Attempting to protect the enchantment was really challenging because any amount of protection that I expended on the bombardment was that much less pressure that I had on ending the game. Attempting to accelerate it out meant that Arcane Bombardment would then use those acceleration effects and pay me with more acceleration that I then couldn't use unless I found acceleration in the form of non-instants and sorceries, which was itself a really interesting deck building challenge. Omniscience is the opposite of a really interesting deck building challenge because you can build a deck that draws cards and accelerates to Omniscience, and if you spend all of your mana on Omniscience just to get it out on whatever turn that you do, you can then do whatever you want. There's no more limits. You just draw the rest of your deck by playing cards that would normally cost mana. You loop your opponent with infinite loops with cards that would normally cost mana. You pay one cheat and you win the game.